is a mystery text. We don't know who was responsible for its creation, or even if it was just one person. We don't know the exact century it was written in, although we can guess it was around 725 to 700 BCE. What we do have is the text itself, the Iliad. And because we have the text, we know how it was created. It was performed verbally, possibly to music, using memorized phrases and improvisation to tell a story that already existed in the form of myth. Which takes me to another thing we don't know, how we actually have it. While classical scholars believed that Homer wrote this down himself, more recently it's been questioned. Would Homer even have been able to write? So roughly 20 years later, we gain the second work of Western literature, the Odyssey, which is also attributed to Homer. Once again, we know very little about its context, except that some of the subject matter was so ancient to whoever created it that they were confused about some of the customs that they depicted, such as dowries. So now, a brief synopsis of both, for anyone who isn't aware of them. The Iliad is set in the last year of the Trojan War, which was won by the soldiers hiding in the wooden horse, if it's still not ringing any bells. The Greeks have been fighting against the Trojans for 9 years for the right to sack Troy, and also return Helen to her original husband, Menelaus. The gods all take sides and get very involved, even on the battlefield. Contrastingly, the Odyssey is about the return of Odysseus from the Trojan War, and the way that he retakes his place as the king of Ithaca. It has many more fantasy elements with giants and cyclopes, but is ultimately a far more peaceful text. There's a much greater emphasis on calmness and the joys of being home. So the third text that I'm going to talk about is not remotely close to the third work of Western literature. It was published in 19 BCE, 700 years after Homer's works. Now, I just want to put this in context, because it's easy to think that things that happened a long time ago were closer together. For us, this would be something written in the 1300s. Imagine comparing the Canterbury Tales to Harry Potter. So the text that I'm talking about is the Aeneid, and we actually know a lot about it. We know that it was written by Virgil after the instatement of Octavian as princeps, which was the first citizen and kind of a supreme ruler, although not with that name. And it followed years of wars and political unrest. And we know that it was written over the course of 10 years. Virgil spent 10 years creating and honing this work, writing around 3 lines a day, until it formed the 9,883 lines that we have today. So now that I've established the ways it's different from Homer's works, I'm going to explain how it's similar. First and foremost, Virgil was hugely inspired by both the Iliad and the Odyssey, to the extent that the first 6 books, in which our protagonist, Aeneas, travels to create a new home and found Rome, have been nicknamed the Odyssey. Unsurprisingly, the second 6 books, in which Aeneas wages war to be able to found Rome, is likened to the Iliad. Virgil also makes use of one of the features that Homer is most famous for, the Homeric simile, which I'll cover more later. Aeneas, like Odysseus, visits the underworld and greets the dead of his past. So the second reason, with the first point taken into account, they're all epic poems. With these similarities, I want to explore the effect that different in composition have on the form and features of these texts. To start with, their structures. The timeline of the Iliad looks like this. So, as you can see, the narrative follows this flow of time, so that one book leads directly on from and is influenced by the last one. The Aeneid takes a similar form. As you can probably guess, the Odyssey does not take this form. It looks more like this. And I want to explain this because I unwittingly made it kind of complicated. So this is like the main flow of time that follows Odysseus, and then this bit happens kind of after or during this bit, and these bits take place before. And it's a bit unexpected that this would be the case, because you would anticipate that a text which has been honed for years to have the more complicated structure. Of course, Homer would have known the story that he was going to tell before he told it and have it planned out. But that doesn't really explain the difference. The most obvious reason is the context. Virgil was writing long after Aristotle's Poetics, which communicates a disdain for the more complicated plots, in which time would not move forward with the narrative, which could have affected creative decisions made. The other reason could simply be that this seems unnecessary. The reason for the structure of the Odyssey is that multiple characters and settings are followed, and the events happen in different places and have to overlap. The Aeneid focuses on the journey of Aeneas, which makes a much simpler timeline, the more logical option. This isn't the only way of looking at structure, though. Another way to view it would be the tension levels through the books of each epic poem, which look more like this. So there's some variation, but it's mostly kind of up, down, quite consistent. And then you have this. And now, the effect of the different processes is much clearer. It becomes far more apparent the amount of detail and the thought that was put in, even just with the knowledge of how each epic poem would be consumed. Virgil wrote the Aeneid intending for people to read it. He knew that someone could read it in one setting, if they were a dedicated and fast enough reader, which I have not done that, and probably thought of his writing in a much more similar way to the way authors do today. As a whole, it had to be engaging all the way through. Homer, however, very much worked in separate installments of his epic poems, and may not have even known that they would be able to be seen as entire works at once. While he still needed to be entertaining and engaging, it was in time slots, which means he didn't need to think about the work as a whole, and the focus on the balance of each segment, as opposed to the overall text, makes it a bit messier. There are also some interesting differences in the use of language. Firstly, the epithets throughout the Iliad and the Odyssey. So for anyone who doesn't know, an epithet is a short description of a character based on their main personality traits or physical qualities. And in Homer, they tend to be repeated very often. So, for example, we have the swift-footed Achilles or the shrewd Odysseus. These phrases were there to flesh out the line and make sure it met syllable requirements. Memorize phrases to make it more manageable. Personally, I think these add character to the text, but because of the regularity in which they occur and their repetitiveness, they can definitely come across as too much or pointless, especially considering that the most translated copies tend to be in prose, which reduces the need for a number of words to fulfill a specific number of syllables in each line. The Aeneid, because of the quantity of time that Virgil had to perfect every line, does not use epithets. Again, I personally believe that this removes a lot of the character from the text, and that a balance could be found, but it also makes the Aeneid a much more natural seeming read, and removes a lot of the issues that arise from this in Homer's epic poetry. What they all do share is the Homeric simile, obviously invented by Homer. They tell a story about an unrelated situation, allowing us to empathize and understand the situation, and then apply the emotion evoked to the character that we have been following, enabling a deeper understanding of their situation. One very noticeable difference, however, is that Virgil tends to use less human imagery. For example, of animals or nature, which often doesn't achieve the same empathetic effect. Perhaps this is a result of an attempt to elevate the style. However, it does provide an example of the way in which having more time to think and plan negatively impacted Virgil's work. However, the Aeneid also has some very beautiful, descriptive passages that Homer's works just lack. This is an area in which the time spent on this work really shines through. The importance of Virgil's choices in words and detail of these sections are what really sets the Aeneid apart from Homer, and the reason that I decided to make my student lecture about this subject. Obviously, it's very difficult to compare something exists to the absence of that thing, but I find it extraordinary the difference that these two methods of composition had. It would have been impossible for Homer, without the luxury of editing or rewrites, to choose the exact words that would have had the most impact. And the great thing about this method is that it's applicable to different works. It's important to highlight what we know of the different processes used as a way to understand different facets of a text, no matter its age or origins.